Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM. Welcome to another edition of Food Farm Talk, where we celebrate food and honor those who champion the cause of food in society.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Food Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM here in Guelph. I'm one of your hosts, Emily Duncan, and I'm here with Abdul Rahim Abdullahi. And today we're doing a live show. We're excited to be talking about a subject that's on the tip of everybody's tongue these days. It's making headlines and frankly causing some worry across the world. And so you might have guessed that's the coronavirus. You know, we're seeing headlines of it's spreading further, and we're really interested in its impact on the supply chain, agriculture, and the food system at large. We're seeing pictures of empty supermarket shelves. And so we wanted to discuss today kind of what's going on and what are some of the repercussions for the food system from a viral outbreak like the coronavirus.
Yeah, so just as Emily has mentioned, the coronavirus has been in the news. I would say even since that was late last year. So even throughout the year, it has been in the news, and we are seeing a lot of impacts on our food system. We are seeing a lot of things happening in grocery stores all around the globe, especially in countries that have been hit hard by the virus. So we just want to touch on a whole lot of issues that are coming out of this epidemic.
Yeah, so maybe just to start, we'll kind of give a lay of the land of where we're at currently with the situation. We've seen that, like, as you mentioned, the virus started late last year. It started in Wuhan, China, and has kind of spread worldwide since there. And we're at over 90,000 cases, over 77 countries. So the WHO, not the band, but the World Health Organization is calling this a global pandemic.
Yeah, so we all know that it started in China, as you mentioned, but over time, that it's been in the space of, say, less than 3 months now, it has reached about 77 countries. So it's becoming a worry for everybody who is concerned, right? Most everybody, because since it's spreading to so many countries, everyone is concerned that we don't really know what will happen if it gets serious. And even here in Canada, like I think globally we've passed 90,000. In Canada, we have about 35 cases from the last time I checked this morning. Yesterday it was 33. So
we're over 30 cases in Canada. The countries that have been really most affected have been China. South Korea has also faced a lot of challenges. Iran and Italy are kind of the four main countries that are really feeling the impacts of this virus. But we're seeing they have the most number of cases, but we're seeing the impacts of the virus happen all across Europe and North America, as it's not the virus that's causing the problems, it's the panic about the virus that's really having an effect on the food system.
And just to add, we know that, so it's having a panic on an impact on the food system, but we are also concerned about the mortality that we are experiencing out of the virus. So right now, the figure stands at over 3,000 deaths. Most of the deaths are actually in China, but currently we've recorded some deaths in the US as well and other countries. So it's a concern.
And it's come to light that there hasn't been, since the start of the outbreak in China, there hasn't been adequate monitoring in all countries around the world. So you have to take these numbers with a bit of a grain of salt if that they haven't been monitored correctly over the past couple of months. And I think the mortality rate is important to think about, because we know that it's about 3.4%. So what does that actually mean? Well, when we think about just general influenza, the mortality rate of that is about 1%. So this is substantially higher, but that doesn't necessarily translate to that it's a more deadly virus. It actually is more that because it's new, nobody has immunity to it. People may not be thinking that's what it was. So it does have a higher mortality rate, but that doesn't necessarily translate to it's more deadly. It presents the same kind of symptoms as the flu, fever, body aches. You're going to be laid up in bed.
So the novelty of this disease makes it very hard for people to actually understand because it's new. We don't know much about it. How do we deal with it? So that is one of the reasons why the mortality is really high, and at least when we compare it to normal flu. So our main concern today is we are talking about coronavirus and the food system, what is happening around the globe, what is happening here in Canada. There's been a lot of issues making news from restaurants, what is happening in supermarkets, what is happening to Canadian exports, and almost similar issues in other countries as well. So we'll talk about all this in today's episode.
Yeah. So kind of one example from right here in Guelph is this week I was going shopping at Costco on Elmira Road here in Guelph, and something that was totally different is normally you get your card and you walk in and they check your Costco membership card. But they had another employee at the door prior to anybody walking in who was sanitizing all the carts, like wiping down the place where you put your hands with Lysol wipes and then throwing those away. And this is something that I'd never seen before. And this is kind of what started a little bit of like alarm in me of like, oh,
why do we
wow.
Why are we doing this? So that means there's an issue of concern that's actually triggering this action. But I haven't seen anything like personally like going to a grocery store. But of course, we've read a lot in the news. But it's good that you've had your fair share of the experience of the impact of corona right here in Guelph. But this is even a place we haven't recorded any case yet.
No, there's been no recorded cases here. But I think I haven't seen this in Guelph, but other stores in Canada are starting to see shortages in supplies. A Costco in Markham reported that they were out of bottled water, toilet paper, and paper towels. So these are the kind of emergency supplies that are being stockpiled first. And so we are starting to see shortages in some places. I saw a headline that in the Northwest Territories, the health advisors there were encouraging people to stock up. And I think that's especially challenging in remote communities. Things are going to sell out quickly in Canada, especially, and it takes a longer time to refill that supply chain. So there definitely is a risk there. And as the panic grows, the more people stockpile, the more disruption to the supply chain is going to happen.
Yeah, but I think in the context of Canada specifically, I think that was on the 27th of February, the health minister actually advised people to encourage people to stockpile food in one way or another and medication, but not to the extent that we are actually seeing. But I know that's one of the reasons why we are beginning to see an impact within our stores. We are beginning to see shelves drying up, especially food items. Like, as you mentioned, there are lots of news items that are talking about this, and people are actually panicking, like what we call a panic buying. People are panicking to buy items just in anticipation of whatever will happen. I don't know if it's necessarily good or bad, but we just hope that it doesn't get to that situation that we need it.
Yeah, I think the health minister, Patty Hadju, making that announcement that people need to stockpile kind of put the wrong idea in people's minds, that people think that they need to stockpile to self-isolate. Like, I can't leave the house because there's, everyone's sick out there. Yeah. If I leave the house, I'm going to get sick as well. Whereas the actual real advice is that you just need enough supplies in case you yourself get sick and you cannot leave your in bed, you can't leave the house, you have the things that you need to get over it and to get better. So that would be like a week or two of supplies, not a month or two of supplies that you're going to stay in your house, right?
Yeah.
So the advice, a more measured advice is just, when you're out doing your normal shopping, to just buy a few items each trip and not do a specific trip to the store where you clean out the shelves.
Yeah, so I think just to iterate what you are saying, the official the official description that's come out of government of Canada is is advising people to actually stockpile food and like basic essentials, water and sanitizers and all those things, but not to go into panic buying. So we're just putting it out there to the public. Yes, it is okay to try to stock a little bit just in case that you have to isolate at home, but we probably don't have to get into that whole lot of panic buying where we are drying up the stores and making kind of disrupting the supply chain. So yeah.
And we've seen this kind of panic buying has had a huge effect on sales of masks and sales of hand sanitizer. And one of the things that we need to be aware of is that there are some people like price gouging these things. For example, on Amazon, we've seen that certain bad actors are selling things of hand sanitizer for over $70 a bottle. And so there are people out there who will take advantage of a crisis. And what's come out of, at least in the UK, large supermarket chains are super conscious of this, and that trying to tell consumers that you're not going to see a rise in food prices because, food retailers can't be seen to be profiting in this type of crisis, right? This isn't the time to raise food prices. It's like we're seeing with other kind of products that are happening, especially like the masks and the hand sanitizer.
So you just mentioned in UK, we are beginning to see measures and kind of official response from grocery retailers in the country. But we haven't really seen much here in Canada. So I think maybe it's an opportunity for the grocery stores to actually give assurance out to the public. But we've gotten assurance from government officials, but the retailers need to come out to kind of assure people that like the supply chain is still intact and there's no need to panic to buy more items, and definitely the prices will not rise just because we will run into shortages. I think this kind of public reassurance will help kind of ease the situation around the country.
Yeah, exactly. For example, in the UK, they have a food chain emergency liaison group for Tesco, which is their largest supermarket supplier. Tesco probably could be considered comparable to Loblaws in Canada. And so they're the ones who are coming out and saying, like, we have a plan. We have a plan in place for this type of emergency. We're not going to be raising food prices. And they're the ones who are, in fact, could be taking a huge loss in profit. They're expecting maybe over $1 billion in loss in profit due to this outbreak. And so, food retailers are definitely going to be suffering. People aren't going about their normal activities and their normal buying activities. So we already know that the market has suffered from this outbreak. Stock markets have seen...
Yes, stock markets have seen drastic downturn.
Drastic downturn, the worst since the financial crisis of 2008. And additionally, there's other types of food retailers, as you mentioned before, restaurants.
That's something I would like us to actually touch on the aspect of the restaurant. So we know that people are changing their shopping patterns, but it's not only about what they eat back home. We are also seeing an impact in the restaurants industry. We are seeing a lot of people changing their habits. There are a lot of stories that have been run around Canada on restaurants, decline in restaurant sales.
In one survey from the UK again, already we're seeing a 9% decrease in restaurant attendance, and it's expected that if more cases of coronavirus come out there, that it'll worsen to about 30% decrease in sales. So that's a huge drop, and it's totally out of these retailers and businesses' control about how this is coming out and how this is happening. But at the same time, it is kind of understandable people's response that if you're afraid of getting sick, you don't want to be out in the public, right?
So one aspect to it that we are seeing in Canada, and it's interesting you have mentioned in UK they are seeing a drop, because there's an article that's run about in Vancouver, Chinese Canadian businesses have actually reported loss up to 70%, which is huge. And we've seen similar trends around the country. I think on the 27th there was an article that was run in the Star that went to Chinatown in Toronto to actually see how businesses are faring, especially restaurants. And the figures were actually worrying because like restaurants are actually reporting losses that range from about 30 to like 70% loss in customers and in their profit margins, which is kind of worrying. We don't, as you mentioned, that sure you want to eat, but you don't want to get sick. But we don't know how these dynamics work because it's actually affecting a very specific demographic. That's another tricky aspect to it.
Yeah, and I think some of those news stories, especially some of the stories that were coming out at the beginning of the year when this started to break and it was kind of isolated to China, is that there was a lot of racialized prejudice that came out against Chinese Canadians and Chinese in general, due to the virus, of people, assuming that people had the virus and these kinds of things, and so, I think that's horrible, and that, it's affecting people's businesses. But at the same time, now we're seeing the virus spread more and more. It's not just isolated to China anymore. So we're having cases in Canada, we're having cases in Europe and in the States. So it's not, I think now we're going to see a widespread effect on businesses.
We are going to definitely feel the impact if it continues, or almost, let's say, all the demographics is not kind of restricted to one group of people, just like we saw in the earlier parts around the globe, where people are beginning to be careful when they are getting close to very certain demographic, which is hitting those businesses. And then we are seeing a lot of issues around travel as well. So, which is kind of interesting. But we also know that one aspect of it is, as we mentioned, on the supply chain. There are a lot of stories in Canada that is running around exports, because Canada is a huge, big destination for Canadian exports. So
we need to be thinking about, are the markets going to be there to buy our exports? China is a huge purchaser of Canadian exports, particularly in canola. And so is a country that's facing a pandemic going to be able to make good on their trade deals? And so, we're seeing headlines around this. There's a lot of speculation, but I think it's a bit early to say how that could play out. We're coming up to spring planting. And so kind of it's shifting away from thinking about the food aspect of it and more of the agriculture aspect of it. I was reading about how will grain planting in China be affected? And will they be able to get all their crops into the ground, given that there's lots of roadblocks set up, that, they're trying to contain the virus, but at the same time, fertilizer supplies need to be spread throughout the country, seeds need to be moved, and planting needs to start relatively soon. So there's a huge challenge there with how the virus is affecting agriculture.
Yeah, and one aspect that we've realized, especially when it comes to export in the Canadian context, has been the seafood. It's already been hit. So because seafood mostly happen throughout the year, and in Atlantic Canada, there have been stories about how this virus has actually affected the seafood market, even in prices. Because I think from the time the virus started late last year till now, there has been a reduction in the price that has fell down from a record high before the time to about 10.50 in terms of per pound to about $8 per pound right now in terms of seafood in Atlantic Canada. So I think fishermen and people in the fisheries industry in Atlantic Canada are actually really worried about this virus, because they are already beginning to see some of its impacts on their sales and their market and all those things. So it's a bit concerning. But of course, as you mentioned, we are also getting into a time where we are beginning to face some of these repercussions in terms of primary production. Because right now, one thing we also know that most of the industries in China is actually shutting down. They are not up to capacity. And we also know that we do get a lot of goods from China. So some of these goods might actually be for the purposes of agriculture in one way or the other. So we might get this ripple effect going through the entire agriculture from when the planting season starts. So we wait to see what actually happens.
Yeah, and I think it's something to think about. People are making comparisons to other outbreaks of like influenza or Spanish flu, and I think what's different now is how globally interconnected we all are. That global markets, goods are moving around the world, and they all really depend on production from another country to make another country's economy work, right? Yeah. So I think something to also think about is like what can be our response to this? And we've already seen a response by the Canadian federal government cutting the interest rates. And so they're down by 0.5 percentage point from 1.75 down to 1.25 to encourage spending. And I think that's also it's interesting for how that might affect agriculture as well, because we know that farmers carry a lot of debt. And so once interest rates are going down, that might encourage more investment in the agricultural sector to try to mitigate the crisis of the coronavirus.
That's quite interesting. And when you look at it, I'm just also wondering whether this will actually translate, this slashing interest rate will actually translate in what farmers do this year. So in terms of equipment purchases and in terms of like trying to get new machinery and all those things, whether it translates into the actual practice down the ground. But these are interesting things that we can't fully understand what it will look like or how it will translate on the ground. But as time goes, and we begin to see some of its impacts on agriculture and entire supply chain.
Yeah. But I think that a lot of people aren't kind of thinking about that far back at the beginning of the supply chain of planting coming up and that kind of thing. But this. Yeah,
it's definitely something we should be thinking about, because, as I said, there's a lot that depends on the relation between Canada and China, especially in agriculture. We know of canola, we know of pork, we know of beef. Like, there's a lot of exports that go to China, and there are a lot of like relations when it comes to the decisions farmers make on the ground. So we do know that this will definitely affect what people do this year.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned pork. And so this coronavirus outbreak in humans is coming right after the outbreak of African swine fever in pigs in China. And so pig herds in China have been remarkably reduced due to African swine fever. And that's a livestock disease that we're globally trying to keep well contained and make sure that doesn't spread. So, which it kind of flared up at the end of last year, and now we're dealing with coronavirus. So it kind of seems like one thing after another.
Yeah, I think there are two things I would really like us to touch on before we go, because this is very interesting to see how we've talked about people panic buying. We are seeing, I don't know, I'm trying to look at it from this perspective. Is this actually a wake-up call to us in terms of how our food system works? Like, if we are seeing the impacts like just over a couple of months, we're actually seeing a breakdown in some parts of our food system. What actually happens if we have something that is serious than this is definitely something we should be thinking about as we continuously talk about how to reshape our food system and how to get things going to make sure that people are not vulnerable. People become more resilient to like these kind of changes, be it in climate change, be it an epidemic like this, or any other like unexpected circumstance or unexpected situation that we find ourselves.
I think that's a really, really good point to kind of end on that. This is a bit of a wake-up call to our food system, and it makes me think back to a quote from Tim Benton, a global food security expert from the UK, and he said, "We're 9 meals away from anarchy," and essentially what that means is like a city like Toronto has 3 days worth of food. And that's it.
So I really see that like this situation is actually putting that quote into test. Like, we are really beginning to see that what will the situation look like if we find ourselves in something that breaks the entire food system down? How long can we survive? Like,
Yeah, and we don't want to cause panic, but that kind of thought and that kind of knowledge about our food system is what drives people to stockpile and to clear out the shelves of knowing that, if the supply chain is disrupted, we're going to be out of food in 3 days. So people want to have a plan for themselves individually in their house, and we're already seeing in some places like Italy that people are fighting over access to resources, and so it's challenging times, and it is causing us to give pause and rethink the food system.
Yeah, it's definitely concerning, like, to see how vulnerable like our food system is, and how vulnerable we are as people, like as our lives actually depend on this food system that is not so resilient from what we are seeing so far. So like I said, it's concerning, but probably it's a wake-up call, and it's something that is actually out to get us to innovate, to get us to think about alternative solutions, to get us to begin to open our minds up to see what we can actually do when situations get worse than this. So there's definitely something good coming out of it in one way or the other, but we will definitely see what it means for us and how we actually try to plan going forward. But we're almost running out of time, but I would like us to actually end on a note of, like, from what we are seeing all through the media and what we are seeing from what people are doing, it's always good to end on a note like, what can our listeners also do in this type of situation? How do you prepare yourself?
Yeah, so I think our final message would be, don't panic, wash your hands, stay safe, and don't clean out the grocery store. Just buy the things that you think you might need a trip at a time.
Yeah, so the situation is not that worse, so let's not panic to create more damage, because we know that sometimes it's not really the disease, but the outcomes of how people are reacting to the disease that is causing some of this issue. And feel free to go out to still eat, just as you said, wash your hands, still go to your favorite restaurants. Don't be hesitant to go out because you think you contract the disease. There's still a lot of room to live your normal life, but in a bit of readjustment of how you do your things. And I think the official government announcement has indicated that we try to plan the way we plan our grocery shopping and all those things, trying to avoid like going at rush hours, or like how we use public transportation, all those things. But just stay safe. Don't panic. The situation is still under control. I don't know if I can say the situation is under control. I'm not in a position of power to say that. But yes, we are still optimistic. So,
all right. Well, take care and tune in next week, Thursday mornings at 10 a.m. for another edition of Food Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM.
Thank you very much for listening to today's episode.